All right. So, as he starts into this whole section, what's up with the Sarah and Hagar analogy? What's going on?
Yeah, that's always been a tricky part for me until I recently reworked through it. Sometimes you might hear the word allegory thrown out, and for me that was puzzling because I was like, boy, is Paul using some sort of weird Bible interpretive method that, we should never use, but it's okay for him to use because he's Paul?
Yeah, is he interpreting like Augustine and Origen and a traditional allegorical interpretation, or is he doing something a little bit different? Or is there something special behind that word allegory that we should know?
Right. The word allegory depends on your English translations. I think maybe some like the NIV might say analogy instead of allegory.
And this is in verse 24, by the way.
The allegory thing that we're talking about here, which is really an analogy, is from 421 to 431. And the word there can be translated, and I think it's less distracting to translate it in English as analogy. And we're used to analogies. They're not so problematic. Trying to teach something or illustrate something by giving an analogy is way more understandable than trying to puzzle through somebody giving an allegorical interpretation. So it's an illustration, not an interpretation that Paul is doing here, using an analogy to do it.
Right. It's easy to go down the path of saying, like, he is teaching us about the ontology of Sarah and Hagar and Jerusalem and Sinai and all these things, when rather he's like, no, I'm just grabbing a Bible story that, I can kind of make a metaphor out of it because you guys know this story.
That's right. It's an illustration from a Bible story. So much less problematic. If you want to look at it that way, then what Paul's doing is still talking about Abraham's heirs or Abraham's descendants. But Abraham's name drops out of the story pretty quickly because what he's really talking about is there's two ways of being descended from Abraham. And instead of focusing on the dad, I'm going to focus on the mothers as representing the two ways. And in the illustration that the Bible story provides, the two mothers are a slave woman and just a woman who is therefore the free woman because she's not enslaved like Hagar. And if this was Origen or Augustine or something and it was allegory, you would expect the explanation Paul gives to unfold differently, where something Sinai would be Sarah, because Jewish people, Sinai is a good thing. Since it's not an allegory, since Paul isn't channeling Origen, he's just giving an illustration. His analogy is, okay, think of the two different ways of being Abraham's children. You can be an enslaved to something child, or you can be a free to enjoy the entire inheritance version of a child. And those two versions of children can be an illustration of being enslaved to Torah observance as a way of relating to God, or simply being free to relate directly to God the same way that Father Abraham himself did. And so Abraham's name drops out and the two mothers become the options. And what kind of child do you want to be, Galatians? And that's the direction he goes with the analogy in this initially confusing sounding paragraph.
Yeah, he's making the same point that he has. Like, look, if you guys want to go for Torah, okay, you're going back to slavery. If you guys want to relate to Christ through faith, through trust in him, then you're heading to Zion. You're heading to his home. You're welcomed into that already.
And that's a good thing, Paul says, because that route of being Abraham's descendant, that actually corresponds to the promise. When God promised Abraham, you and your people are going to be my people, that promise goes through the I want to relate directly to God way of relating to God and having access to the promise. And the way you just pointed out, Caleb, where Paul's explanation goes to Zion to explain the fullness of this, that's exactly right, because in 427, Paul doesn't say, yeah, being the child of promise and choosing to relate to God the same way that Abraham did leads to the happy ending in Genesis. It leads to the happy ending in the biggest eschatological expectation of Isaiah. And Paul's claim is, now in this moment of history, Jesus triggered that eschatological moment, and the Jesus people are realizing the fullness of that eschatological heritage. So you want to be a descendant of Abraham in the child of promise, child of freedom route, to be in the group of people who are fully realizing that big, fat eschatological picture that we want to see.
Right. No, I think that's really helpful because it can be easy, again, like I've said, to go down that route of interpretation where Paul is actually telling us how to interpret this passage in Genesis, or the understanding of Sinai and Jerusalem throughout the Bible as metaphorical or allegorical for something else. That's just simply not what he's doing. He's making a very pragmatic illustration. He's doing something very pastoral here. So, yeah, thanks for walking us through that. I think that's really helpful. So as we continue on in chapter 5, how does he continue making his point about slavery under the legal observation of Torah, or at least what these Judaizers are pushing, versus the freedom that is analogous to, the freedom that is represented by Jerusalem through trust in Jesus?
Well, Paul's going to draw that out by talking about, which people really, really live as God's people, the people that are doing what the agitators say or not. And the way you framed it was really good, because it does, in chapter 5, fill out more what that illustration in the end of chapter 4 was just setting up. If we've entered into sort of Paul's second argument, or the second half of this long argument, 4:21 through 6:10 is that second argument. So that illustration of which version of Abraham's true heirs do you want to be? Well, you want to be the freedom and the realizing Zion's eschatology and the promise version of Abraham's heirs. That's where chapter 5 is going to pick up and say, okay, how do you do that? Who really does that? Is it the people who are listening to the agitators that really do that? Or is it people who live out the life of the gospel that I, Paul, left you with are really doing that? And he's going to say, well, it's the people who are following what I left you with. And what did I leave you with? I left you with living life in the Spirit, the promised Spirit, the Spirit of that marks out the turning of the eschatological age. And that was going to be the sign that the people who had it were really, really God's people. That's
right. And I think as you go through, starting in 5:2, he picks up on the circumcision language again, and you can almost replace, that's exactly what he intends, is to replace the word Torah here with circumcision, because if you go back to the idea in the beginning of chapter 4, where if you guys take on Torah in this idolatrous way, it is a god for you. It is a false god for you. And here he swaps that language out with saying, if you accept circumcision, Christ will be no advantage to you.
Yeah, we're going to come up to that part, but in chapter 5, the danger is you're actually severing yourself from Christ. Which is a nice wordplay, right? Circumcision involves severing. And by doing that
I guess it's more the flip side of chapter 4, rather than, the mirror of it, rather than another expression of it.
Right.
But yeah, that's pretty good irony too.
Yeah. So if the argument in that sort of initially difficult analogy at the end of chapter 4 was you want to be this version of Abraham's heir, in about 5:1-12, you get some more application and appeal language that's still serving this argumentative function. And this hinge verse was for our freedom, for its own sake that Christ freed us, meaning freedom from having to relate to God using Torah observance as a fundamental aspect of that relationship, but also just to be free. So to be free from having to relate to God that way, but also just to be free, just to have the full experience of living life as a restored human in relationship with the God that you're supposed to reflect or mirror. So Paul says, therefore, it sounds like ethics, but it's not. He's giving argumentation. I want you to not weigh yourself down by Torah observance, not become a slave again, and continue to live the free life of the Spirit. In the rest of 5:1-12, he says, if you become circumcised, then you're rejecting freedom. And if you hold on to freedom, then you're going to have to reject the intruding teaching of these agitators and not worry about the irrelevancy of circumcision as part of the ongoing Christian life. And then he says, you guys were doing great, and you guys were in relationship with me. And this is the part I said a few moments ago where Paul appeals to, we have this great relationship. Where did you go? I'm still here wanting to be in relationship with you. And if you want to be in relationship with me, then trust me. And look at these agitators who really are just looking out for the fact that they are trying to get their own view of things out there, even at your own expense. And they're agitating you. This is where we get that language. They're upsetting you by coming in here and threatening your entire relationship, walk with God and Jesus. So that's 5:1-12 in it.
Yeah, and this is where we get that mentioned earlier, the language about Paul wanting them to emasculate themselves.
Right. At the very end of that, his spiciness
comes slipping of the knife.
Yep.
language. And so, yeah, and it seems like, as you were saying, these Judaizers, these false teachers and things, they're coming in and they're there for self-service. They're there simply, just for their own selfish reason, their own gain, whatever exactly that may look like practically. And so I wonder if that's really the thrust of why he goes into, I know Paul, he talks a lot about unity, but I wonder if it has a special surgical intention here where he's talking about love and serve one another, not yourselves, here in like 13 through 14, and then he gets into that more practically in the rest of the chapter.
Yeah, going forward, he so if we say that in 4:21 to 31, he started off the argument with that illustration, he pauses in 5:1 to 12 for some persuasive, some argumentative appeal and application, and then in 5:13 forward, he resumes his argumentation, and he does get into that. He says, as I was saying before, it was to freedom that you were called, brothers and sisters, right? And then as you just said, Caleb, he says, look at what happens if you don't have the right kind of freedom, and if it's not spirit-led, it causes all these kinds of breakdown in the relationships of the community of faith that you have there at Galatia. So Paul is probably writing in response to the fact that they have started to experience all sorts of breakdown in their community. They don't know why. They don't realize, like Paul does, it's because you're listening to the agitators and practicing what they say to practice.
Now that's a little bit different than what I've thought. That's interesting. So I feel like there's a few. Typically, you may, especially maybe in a hyper traditional setting, you may read the lists of the fruits of the flesh and the fruits of the spirit as like these are the things Paul lists as the fruits of these things. Like these are the fruits. Whereas I feel like a better reading is to say these are, a few representatives of fruits of flesh versus spirit. Paul's just making giving a few examples of, hey, these are bad things that break down the community. These are a few good things that lift up the community. This is not an all-inclusive list, but they're
absolutely.
Just representatives. But I think what you just brought out as a possibility, and this is interesting. I'm curious if there's anything in the text that really forces you to go this way, or if it's just kind of a very intriguing possibility. But you think he's listing specific sins that may have been already manifesting themselves in the breakdown of this community because of the twisting of the gospel that has happened.
Yes, although that's a little speculative, maybe we can strike a middle ground and say he's listing off general things, some of which are indeed manifesting themselves in their community. Because in that first little part in verse 13 and 5:13, a few sentences in, he says, look, each one of you is to love your neighbor as yourself. Great, that's what Scripture says. And the agitators would claim our way is the way to do that. And Paul's saying, no, the life of the Spirit is the way to do that. Because the next sentence that Paul says is, when you all are biting and devouring each other, then watch out that you don't get consumed by one another. So that biting and devouring and self-consuming is what's happening in Galatia that Paul has to intervene in. He doesn't actually do a lot of pastoral theology in this letter, but his argumentation has pastoral theology implications because of what they're currently undergoing and experiencing. So if he corrects their theology, it ought to correct their behavior and ought to have the result of solving the things that they're facing, and they can't figure out where did these problems all come from all of a sudden.
Right. Yeah, this isn't armchair theology. This is very practical. Like, let's correct your belief system so that how you actually function as the community of Christ is corrected. Me and Nate were actually talking about this a while back, not on the podcast, but we were just kind of having the conversation about the fruit of the Spirit. Here, it's in the context of, hey, this is how you guys need to be God's kingdom, be His community. So it's community oriented. And so really, some people have gotten confused on the fruits of the Spirit as well, where, this person is showing all of these fruits, but they don't believe in Christ. They're not part of His community. But I just can't see them as not being, a Christian or something like that via their virtues because they show all these fruits of the Spirit. And, well, ultimately, all the fruit of the Spirit, they are ways that the people are to function effectively as God's community, God's kingdom. So if all of these virtues are not in the service of the larger community and kingdom of Christ, they're not actually fruits of the Spirit. They don't count.
I'm so glad you said that because it makes me feel better. It makes me feel like I'm in good company because I agree with that completely. When you look at the fruits of the Spirit, they include such things as love, joy, peace, but I like the word shalom myself. Long-suffering, kindness, goodness. Like you just pointed out, those are all character traits that are lived out in action in relationship. They're not internal virtues. They're relational. They're virtues that are expressed in relationship and characterize the way that somebody who has the Spirit treats another person. So you have long-suffering towards another person. You are kind towards another person. You have ongoing faithfulness towards the people in the community of faith in Galatia. You are gentle and exhibit self-control towards the fellow believers in Galatia. So the thing that you just pointed out, I think, is exactly right. And that's why, like you said, this isn't armchair theology. This is correction of theology that has to do with the practice that they're actually practicing as the Christian faith right now in Galatia.
Right. And this is a tangent I could get off on for a while, but like I feel like I've got to say too that it's in the ancient Near East and in the biblical conception, sharing that ancient Near Eastern thought world, creation is not about necessarily the creation of the material, but it's about the creation of a society in which the deity dwells. And creation in the Bible is about the creation of, again, a society, a kingdom, a people, in the midst of which Yahweh dwells. And so to bear these fruits is to contribute to that creation, to have these virtues, but not in the service of building up that kingdom, of building up the pinnacle of creation. You're either contributing to God's creation or you're not. You're either part of it or outside of it. I feel like that's a good framework as seeing the kingdom as creation and exhibiting these fruits as contributing to that creation as a helpful framework that's one biblical, but also just helps you reorient the importance of the focus of the fruits, not just the bearing of the fruits.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that means that Paul wants the people in Galatia here in the first century to be a pocket of God's kingdom.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm tracking with you. So you were arguing that the fruits of the flesh were a result of them accepting some of the agitators' beliefs? Or did I understand, was that what you were saying? Or did I misunderstand that?
I think that's pretty close. I think Paul's warning is when you follow the agitators, when you capitulate and reintroduce Torah observance as one of their very fundamental aspects of relating to God and Jesus, then you abandon the genuine relationship that you're supposed to have with God and Jesus. And when you're cut off from that relationship, you're cut off from the empowering presence of Jesus, of the Spirit.
Right.
And your life is going to show that you've been cut off from Jesus' empowering presence.
Okay. So, okay.
And some of those things may have manifested in the community, and that may be why he calls them out, but we don't have the textual certainty to say so.
Okay. Because when I was reading this, I was thinking, so starting in verse 13, that Paul's almost like he's saying, don't let the pendulum go too far the other way, where you recognize your freedom and you're under the law, and now you just treat everybody like dirt. That's not the kind of freedom I'm talking about. Does that make sense?
Right. The whole premise is that the Galatians are saved people, and so living their life doesn't mean, as a Christian, living with complete abandon and freedom. It means living as people who are freed from, as Caleb pointed out earlier, the stoicheia, the ungod ways of living in the world. They're not freed to nothing. They're freed to be enslaved to Jesus and God in the Spirit. So they're not freed to do whatever they want and treat anybody the way that they want. They're finally freed from a pre-God, wicked, depraved character to finally live as the fully restored images of God they're meant to live as. And so in their freedom, they're able to finally live by the Spirit, to exhibit fruits of the Spirit that a human deep down really wants to be able to live in terms of and exhibit. That's the freedom that they're called to.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So for Paul, he's talking about the Spirit being proof in their life of what he is saying about the gospel, with it being grace alone being better. So in what way are the people seeing the Spirit? What does it mean for them to be Spirit-led people as proof of what Paul is saying?
That's something that I think is really important here in what Paul is saying, and I'm always a little bit nervous about talking about it because I don't want to prescribe things. I don't want to say the Galatians experience is normative for all Christians everywhere at all times, or this is how it should look. But it seems like from chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, the Galatians had already experienced all sorts of spiritual events and the empowering presence of God's Spirit in their community. So in Galatians 5, I suppose, especially like 5:13 through the end of the chapter, Paul is saying, here are two ways of life: the life according to the Spirit, or the life by the Spirit, or of the Spirit. He kind of says it variously, and then life according to the flesh. And in the same way that Paul did that sort of shocker moment of saying, you know what, injecting Torah observance into a life of faith with God now is just like another one of those, lowercase g pagan gods. He kind of says the same thing in this mode of language. You know what? Now there's lots of ways of trying to rise to God or appease God that are out there as religious options, and injecting Torah observance into the life of a Christian is just another one of those ways. And it's like, whoa, he's really sort of relegating Torah observance to one of the versions of life according to flesh. Yes, he is. Like, we've already qualified that. We don't mean Torah is bad. Paul's already gone out of his way to say Torah is great.
Right.
But following the agitator's lead here and saying this is the theology of the Christian life that you need to have going forward is wrong, because their version is another one of the ways of the flesh. And in contrast to that, Paul's referencing the fact that the Galatians, at least previously, already had the life of the Spirit. And they need to continue to live that life. It's not just about theology. It's about their actual relationship with God and on the ground in real time. They need to continue living that life the way they had before the agitators intruded. And
so do you have any comment on what exactly that life might have been? Like, was Spirit-empowered life them living out love like Paul is saying, or was it something like in Acts where they had tangible events that occurred that were, beyond natural power that kind of validated them? Or do you have any comment on that?
It seems like from just internally the letter of Galatians itself, it's both of those. Like back in chapter 1, when Paul's recounting his initial trip to Galatia as a result of a health problem, he says, I shared with you the saving message of the kingdom, and there was the power of the Spirit that brought that out in reality for you all the way back then. And they've been, at least until the agitators intruded, they've been living the life of the Spirit, living out the fruits of the Spirit that we see listed here as a way of creating and sustaining the community of faith that they'd had in Galatia all that time. And in 3:1-6, you foolish Galatians, having begun the Spirit, we know that there has to be big kind of important, flashy, cool things that they've got in their own local church history that are kind of analogous to the kinds of things you see in the book of Acts. So, like I said, I hesitate to be too detailed. I don't want to be prescriptive about what all Christians should do now, but it seems that Paul, he's not even teaching. He's just referencing their past experience as an obvious presumption that, of course, this is what it is like to live in relationship with God and Jesus. This is just the normal way.
Whether it was through your...
Yeah. For them...
Yeah, whether it was through your actions changing on an unrecognizable scale, or whether it was through some sort of supernatural invention, like God showed up. And so that is a tangible moment that you can remember where God accepted you into his family.
Yeah, and the Galatians had those kinds of moments and that kind of transformational experience as a matter of course. That was not something that's not what Paul is trying to coach them into working up towards in Galatians. That's something they've already had that Paul can refer to casually and say, oh yeah, this is normal for you guys. Why are you abandoning what's normal for some other weird thing? And both of those things that you just said, events and also transformation, those are part of the biography of the Galatian church up until the agitators intruded.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, especially just comparing whether it's supernatural things happening and ceasing, or the fruits of the Spirit shifting into the fruits of the flesh. Like he's saying and showing and maybe just pointing out, like, hey, there are changes that are very clear. You guys have departed from what is normative of the community of Christ.
Yeah.
And so this is just a bad route to go.
Now they're devouring one another, and they're threatening to sever themselves from Christ because they think our relationship with God and Jesus isn't just based on grace, it's based on grace plus this other thing that the agitators are inserting into our normal Christian practice.
Absolutely. Well, this has been really good. So we've gotten up through chapter 5 in this episode. And so what we'll do is next time we will probably jump in and tackle chapter 6 and also do some wrap-up thoughts about the book of Galatians just overall as a whole, assuming we get those into one episode, maybe 2. We'll see. So we'll see how the next little bit goes, because this has been fun. It's been good. And I feel like it's been really, really helpful as we tackle the book of Galatians and get to understand its finer points and its broad points.
Great, thank you. I think it's been really fun to do this, and I'm looking forward to being able to finish out strong too.
Yeah, Aaron, this has been hugely helpful. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here.